Chapter 1, New Year's Night. On December 31st, 2008, celebrations were underway across the Bay Area. Fireworks lit the sky over San Francisco, bars were packed, and public transit systems prepared for the annual rush of revelers heading home after midnight. The Bay Area Rapid Transit System had extended service that night to accommodate the crowds. Trains ran back and forth beneath the bay, carrying passengers between San Francisco and Oakland long after midnight. Among the riders that evening was Oscar Grant. Born in 1986, Grant had grown up in the East Bay. By 2009, he was a young father with a small daughter. Friends described him as charismatic and energetic, someone who loved music and enjoyed spending time with his family. Like many people his age, Grant had also struggled. He had experienced run-ins with the law and had spent time in prison earlier in his life. But at the time of New Year's Eve 2008, he was trying to stabilize his life. He was working, spending time with his girlfriend and daughter, and trying to move forward. That night, he joined several friends for a trip into San Francisco to celebrate the new year. As midnight passed and fireworks faded over the bay, the group boarded a BART train heading back toward Oakland. The cars were crowded with passengers who had spent the night partying. Alcohol was flowing, voices were loud, and tensions were high in the tightly packed train cars. At some point during the ride, a fight broke out. Witness accounts later varied widely about what happened. Some said Grant was involved in the confrontation. Others insisted he was trying to calm things down. What is clear is that someone on the train reported the disturbance to BART police. Officers were waiting when the train pulled into the Fruitvale Station in Oakland. As the doors opened, BART police ordered several passengers off the train. Among those pulled onto the platform was Oscar Grant. The situation escalated quickly. Officers pushed several young men against the wall and began detaining them. Confusion spread through the crowd. Passengers who had been celebrating minutes earlier suddenly found themselves watching a tense police confrontation. Many began pulling out their phones. At the time, smartphones were still relatively new, but cameras were common. People started recording what they were seeing. Those recordings would soon become some of the most widely viewed police videos in the world. Grant was eventually forced to the ground. He lay face down on the platform, with officers surrounding him. Witnesses shouted from the train windows. Some yelled for the police to stop. Others called out Grant's name. One officer, Johannes Mehserle, stood nearby. Moments later, he drew his weapon. A single shot rang out. Within seconds, the platform descended into chaos. Passengers screamed. Someone shouted that the officer had shot him. Grant lay bleeding on the concrete as stunned witnesses watched through the train windows. Paramedics would arrive soon after and rush him to the hospital, but the damage had already been done. Just hours into the first day of 2009, Oscar Grant III was dead, and the videos of his final moments were already spreading across the internet. This is AI True Crime. Chapter 2, The Videos That Changed Everything. In the hours after the shooting, confusion and anger spread quickly through Oakland. Witnesses who had been on the train or standing on the platform at the Fruitvale Station struggled to process what they had seen. A young man had been pinned face down on the ground. Several police officers had surrounded him. Then, suddenly, a gunshot. That young man was Oscar Grant III. At first, the details were unclear. Early reports simply stated that a suspect had been shot by police during a disturbance on the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. But something about the story immediately felt different. Passengers had seen everything, and many of them had recorded it. Several witnesses had been standing inside the train cars when BART police began detaining passengers on the platform. As the confrontation unfolded, people pressed against the windows and began filming with their phones. The cameras captured the officers pulling several young men off the train and forcing them against the wall. They captured the moment when Grant was placed face down on the platform, and they captured the instant when Officer Johannes Mehserle drew his weapon and fired. Within hours, those recordings began appearing online. This was still the early era of viral video, but platforms like YouTube were already powerful tools for spreading information. Someone uploaded footage of the shooting, and the clip began circulating rapidly. Viewers across the country suddenly found themselves watching a shaky but unmistakable recording of a man being shot while lying on the ground. The videos were disturbing. Grant could be seen lying face down with officers holding him in place. Witnesses shouted in the background. Some yelled warnings to the officers. Others shouted that the man was unarmed. Then the gunshot rang out, followed by chaos and screams from the crowd. The recordings showed Grant clutching his side as officers moved around him in confusion. For many viewers, the footage raised immediate questions. Why had the officer fired his weapon while the suspect was already restrained? Why was a gun used instead of less lethal force? And why did the officers initially appear unsure about how to respond afterward? The videos did not provide every answer, but they showed enough to spark outrage. Local television stations soon began airing the footage. Community leaders demanded explanations from BART officials. Civil rights groups began calling for an independent investigation. The incident quickly transformed from a local police shooting into a national controversy. The BART Police Department initially offered few details about what had happened. Officials confirmed that an officer had discharged a firearm during an arrest at the Fruitvale Station. They stated that the shooting was under investigation and asked the public to remain calm while the facts were gathered. But the videos made it impossible to control the narrative. People were no longer relying on official statements alone. They could see the shooting with their own eyes. As the footage spread, the name AMGrant began appearing everywhere. Friends and family spoke to reporters about the young father who had been killed. Community activists began organizing protests in Oakland. Within days, hundreds of people gathered in the streets demanding justice. The situation was quickly escalating. Public pressure was mounting, and the existence of multiple videos meant that investigators could not ignore what had happened on that platform. The evidence was already circulating worldwide. Meanwhile, Officer Johannes Mehserle had been placed on administrative leave. The BART Police Department announced that it would conduct an internal review of the shooting, while outside agencies began examining the case as well. But for many residents of Oakland, the question was no longer whether the shooting had happened. The world had already seen it, and now they wanted to know whether anyone would be held accountable. Chapter 3. Oakland erupts. By the time the first week of January 2009 began, the shooting of AMGrant III had already become a national story. The videos recorded on the platform at the Fruitvale Station continued to circulate across the internet and television news broadcasts. With every replay, the images grew more disturbing to viewers who saw a young man lying face down on the ground as an officer's gun discharged into his back. The recordings were difficult to watch, but they were impossible to ignore. In Oakland, the response was immediate and emotional. Community members gathered for vigils and rallies, demanding answers about what had happened that night on the Bay Area Rapid Transit platform. Friends and relatives of Grant spoke publicly about the young father who had been killed. They described a man who loved his daughter, who had struggled in life, but was trying to build something better for himself and his family. For them, the videos were not abstract evidence in a legal case. They were the last images of someone they loved. The anger that spread through Oakland was fueled by a long history of tension between police and the community. For decades, residents had argued that law enforcement agencies treated young black men as suspects first and citizens second. The footage of Grant's death seemed to confirm the worst fears of many people who believed excessive force was often used without consequences. Every time the video aired on television or appeared online, it intensified the sense that something deeply wrong had taken place. Protests began forming in the days after the shooting. Hundreds of people marched through downtown Oakland, carrying signs and chanting Grant's name. Demonstrators demanded that the officer involved in the shooting, Johannes Mehserle, be arrested and charged with a crime. They also called for major reforms to the BART Police Department and for greater oversight of transit officers who operated across multiple cities in the Bay Area. City officials struggled to respond to the rapidly growing outrage. Oakland leaders called for calm while investigations continued. But many residents believed those calls sounded like excuses. The presence of video evidence made the situation feel different from previous police shootings that had relied largely on officer testimony. This time, thousands of people had seen the incident unfold for themselves. As the protests grew larger, tensions on the streets began to rise. Demonstrators filled intersections and marched toward government buildings, while police attempted to control the crowds. The atmosphere was charged with anger, grief, and distrust. What had begun as peaceful demonstrations slowly began to fracture as some participants demanded more direct confrontation with authorities. 2009, a large protest gathered in downtown Oakland. The demonstration began peacefully, with speakers addressing the crowd and calling for justice for AMGrant. As the evening wore on, however, the mood shifted. A smaller group within the crowd began vandalizing property and confronting police lines. Windows were smashed, fires were set in the streets, and officers responded with tear gas and arrests. The unrest shocked many observers who were watching events unfold across the country. News footage showed burning trash bins and broken storefronts as police attempted to regain control of the city center. Oakland had experienced protests before, but this time the catalyst was a single moment captured on video and replayed endlessly across the nation. For many protesters, the riots were not simply about one shooting. They represented years of frustration and anger about policing and inequality. The death of Oscar Grant had become a symbol of a larger struggle between communities and law enforcement institutions that many people believed had long avoided accountability. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting continued quietly behind the scenes. State authorities and prosecutors began reviewing the video footage, frame by frame, interviewing witnesses who had been present on the platform that night. The evidence was overwhelming in one respect. The entire incident had been recorded from multiple angles. The central question now facing investigators was not whether the shooting had occurred. It was whether the officer who fired the shot would face criminal charges for pulling the trigger. Chapter 4: The Arrest. As protests continued across Oakland, pressure mounted on investigators and prosecutors to determine whether the shooting of Oscar Grant III constituted a crime. Demonstrators filled the streets demanding accountability, while community leaders warned that public trust in law enforcement was collapsing. The presence of multiple videos documenting the incident made it impossible for authorities to treat the case as a routine internal review. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the Bay Area Rapid Transit Police Department. The Alameda County District Attorney's Office began reviewing the evidence, while outside agencies gathered witness statements from passengers who had been present on the train and the platform that night. Prosecutors examined every available recording, comparing angles from different cameras to reconstruct the exact sequence of events leading to the gunshot. One of the central figures in the investigation was the officer who fired the shot, Johannes Mehserle. Mehserle was a young officer who had joined the BART police force only a few years earlier. In the days after the shooting, he was placed on administrative leave, while investigators began collecting testimony from other officers who had been present at the scene. As the videos spread across television networks and the internet, a key question emerged. Why had Mehserle drawn his firearm when Grant was already pinned face down on the ground? Witnesses on the train could be heard shouting that the man was unarmed, and the footage appeared to show officers physically restraining him before the shot was fired. The visual evidence intensified demands that prosecutors pursue criminal charges. Behind the scenes, investigators also reviewed statements from Mehserle and the other officers involved in the arrest. According to later accounts, Mehserle claimed that he had intended to use his taser rather than his handgun. The argument was that, in the confusion of the moment, he had mistakenly drawn his firearm instead of the less lethal device. The explanation quickly became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Critics argued that the physical differences between a taser and a handgun were significant enough that such a mistake seemed unlikely. Others pointed out that the videos appeared to show Mehserle standing up, drawing his weapon, and firing in a deliberate motion, rather than reacting impulsively. While prosecutors continued reviewing the evidence, public demonstrations intensified. Protesters demanded not only charges, but immediate action against the officer. Some activists argued that if an ordinary citizen had fired a gun under similar circumstances, an arrest would have occurred almost immediately. The situation reached a turning point in mid-January 2009. After reviewing the available evidence, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office announced that it had filed criminal charges against Johannes Mehserle. The charge was murder, a decision that immediately drew national attention. Before authorities could take him into custody, however, Mehserle left California and traveled to Nevada. Investigators quickly located him in the city of Reno, where he surrendered to police and was taken into custody. His arrest marked the first time in California history that a police officer had been charged with murder for an on-duty shooting. The news spread rapidly through Oakland and across the country. For many protesters, the arrest represented a moment of validation after weeks of demonstrations demanding justice. Others cautioned that filing charges was only the beginning of a long legal process that would ultimately be decided in court. Johannes Mehserle was extradited back to California and booked into jail while awaiting trial. The case would soon become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the United States. The shooting of Oscar Grant had already shaken Oakland. Now the nation would watch as the legal system attempted to determine whether the officer responsible would be convicted of a crime. Chapter 5. Preparing for Trial. After the arrest of Johannes Mehserle, the case surrounding the death of Oscar Grant III moved into a new phase. What had begun as a chaotic incident on a train platform had now become a complex criminal prosecution that would be scrutinized by the entire country. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, investigators, and civil rights groups all prepared for what promised to be one of the most closely watched police shooting trials in modern American history. The legal responsibility for prosecuting the case rested with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Their task was to prove that Mehserle's actions on the platform of the Bay Area Rapid Transit Station constituted murder under California law. That meant establishing not only that the officer had fired the fatal shot, but that the act met the legal definition of unlawful killing with the required level of intent. Prosecutors faced both advantages and challenges in building their case. The greatest advantage was the existence of multiple videos capturing the shooting. Several passengers had recorded the incident from different vantage points inside the train cars. Investigators carefully synchronized these recordings, using them to construct a timeline of the moments leading up to the gunshot. The footage clearly showed Grant lying face down on the platform, with officers restraining him when Mehserle drew his weapon. At the same time, prosecutors knew that video evidence alone would not automatically guarantee a conviction. The defense team representing Mehserle quickly began shaping a different narrative of what had occurred that night. Their central argument focused on the claim that the officer had intended to deploy his taser rather than his handgun. According to the defense, the chaotic circumstances on the crowded platform created a moment of confusion in which Mehserle mistakenly drew the wrong weapon. The distinction between those two possibilities would become critical to the outcome of the trial. If jurors believed the shooting had been an intentional act, prosecutors hoped they would support the murder charge. If jurors accepted the explanation that the officer had made a tragic mistake while attempting to subdue a suspect, the legal consequences could be dramatically different. The intense public reaction to the shooting created another complication for the court system. Demonstrations had continued in Oakland, and many residents expressed strong opinions about the case long before the trial began. Defense attorneys argued that it would be impossible for their client to receive a fair trial in Alameda County because the local community had already formed judgments based on the widely circulated videos and media coverage. A judge eventually agreed that the case had generated extraordinary publicity. In response, the court ordered that the trial be moved out of the Bay Area entirely. The proceedings would instead take place in the Southern California city of Los Angeles, where officials believed it might be easier to select an impartial jury. The decision to relocate the trial sparked mixed reactions. Some community members feared that moving the proceedings hundreds of miles away would distance the case from the people most directly affected by Grant's death. Others believed the change of venue was necessary to ensure that the verdict would be accepted as legitimate, regardless of the outcome. As the trial date approached in 2010, both sides intensified their preparations. Prosecutors assembled witness lists that included passengers who had recorded the shooting, police officers who had been present on the platform, and forensic experts who would analyze the trajectory of the bullet. Defense attorneys prepared to challenge those interpretations and emphasize the argument that Mehserle had mistakenly drawn his firearm while attempting to use his taser. Meanwhile, the videos that had first ignited the controversy continued to circulate widely. News outlets replayed the footage repeatedly, while commentators debated whether the images showed an intentional act of violence or a catastrophic error in judgment. For the family of Oscar Grant, the approaching trial represented both hope and uncertainty. The legal process would finally examine the events that had taken place on the Fruitvale Station platform, but no verdict could change the fact that Grant had lost his life. When the trial began in Los Angeles, the jury would be asked to decide a question that had already divided the country. Was the shooting a crime or a tragic mistake committed in the chaos of a New Year's night arrest? Chapter 6. The Trial. In June 2010, the trial of Johannes Mehserle began in the courthouse of Los Angeles. The case had been moved from Oakland after the judge ruled that the level of publicity surrounding the death of Oscar Grant III made it impossible to guarantee an impartial jury in the Bay Area. Even in Los Angeles, however, the case drew intense attention from national media outlets, legal analysts, and civil rights advocates who understood that the verdict could influence public trust in law enforcement for years to come. The courtroom quickly became the center of a legal battle over how to interpret the events of January 1, 2009. Prosecutors from the Alameda County District Attorney's Office presented the case as a straightforward example of excessive force. They argued that Mehserle had deliberately drawn his firearm while Grant was restrained on the platform of the Bay Area Rapid Transit Station. The prosecution emphasized the video recordings that showed Grant lying face down while officers held him in place. Jurors were shown the footage repeatedly during the trial. Each recording captured slightly different angles of the confrontation, but together they created a detailed visual record of the incident. Prosecutors paused the videos frame by frame, pointing out the positions of the officers, the posture of Grant's body, and the moment when Mehserle stood up and reached for his weapon. The prosecution argued that the deliberate motion of drawing and firing the gun demonstrated conscious intent. Witness testimony added further detail to the sequence of events. Passengers who had been inside the train described shouting warnings to the officers as the arrest unfolded. Several witnesses recalled yelling that Grant was unarmed and pleading with police to stop. Some described the shock and disbelief they felt when the gunshot rang out across the platform. The defense presented a very different interpretation of those same moments. Mehserle's attorneys focused on the claim that the officer had intended to use his taser rather than his handgun. According to their argument, the chaotic environment of the crowded station created a moment of confusion during which Mehserle reached for the wrong weapon. They emphasized that tasers and firearms were carried on opposite sides of an officer's body, but argued that under stress, an officer might make a tragic mistake. During the trial, Mehserle himself took the witness stand. He testified that he believed Grant was resisting arrest, and that he had intended to deploy his taser to gain control of the situation. According to his account, he realized only after firing the weapon that he had drawn his handgun instead. The courtroom fell silent as jurors listened to the officer describe the moment he said he understood what had happened. The defense also called expert witnesses who discussed the phenomenon of weapon confusion, a psychological explanation suggesting that officers can sometimes mistakenly draw the wrong device under conditions of stress and rapid decision-making. Prosecutors challenged that theory aggressively, pointing out the physical differences between a taser and a handgun, as well as the training officers receive to prevent such mistakes. Outside the courthouse, the trial continued to generate intense public interest. Demonstrators gathered regularly in Oakland and other cities, holding signs bearing Oscar Grant's name and calling for justice. News outlets reported daily on courtroom developments, turning witness testimony and legal arguments into national headlines. Inside the courtroom, the jury listened carefully as both sides presented their final arguments. Prosecutors urged jurors to rely on the visual evidence captured on the platform that night. They argued that the videos showed a restrained man who posed no immediate threat when the shot was fired. Defense attorneys asked the jury to consider the possibility that the tragedy had been the result of a catastrophic mistake, rather than intentional violence. They reminded jurors that the law required proof of criminal intent for a murder conviction. After weeks of testimony and legal arguments, the case was finally placed in the hands of the jury. The question they faced was the same one that had divided the public since the first video appeared online. Was the shooting of Oscar Grant an intentional crime, or a fatal error made in a moment of confusion? Chapter 7. The Verdict. On July 8, 2010, the jury in Los Angeles reached its decision in the trial of Johannes Mehserle. After weeks of testimony, the jurors had spent several days reviewing the evidence and debating the arguments presented by both sides. Their task had been to determine whether Mehserle's actions during the arrest of Oscar Grant III constituted murder, or whether the defense's explanation of a mistaken weapon had created reasonable doubt. The verdict reflected the complexity of that question. The jury rejected the prosecution's charge of murder. They also declined to convict Mehserle of voluntary manslaughter. Instead, the jury found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a lesser offense that acknowledged criminal wrongdoing but did not require proof that the officer intended to kill Grant. The decision immediately sent shockwaves through the Bay Area. For many observers, the verdict seemed to confirm that the jury had accepted at least part of the defense's argument, that the shooting had been an error, rather than a deliberate act. Involuntary manslaughter under California law generally applies when a death results from reckless or negligent behavior, rather than intentional violence. In the courtroom, the announcement of the verdict brought visible reactions from both sides. Members of Grant's family expressed grief and frustration, believing the evidence supported a more serious conviction. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, described the outcome as recognition that Mehserle had not acted with murderous intent. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to relay the news to the rest of the country. Cameras and microphones captured the reactions of legal experts, activists, and community leaders who had followed the case closely. Within minutes, the verdict became breaking news across national television networks and online media outlets. In Oakland, officials prepared for the possibility of unrest as residents absorbed the outcome. The memory of earlier protests and riots remained fresh, and city leaders feared that anger over the verdict could spark another wave of demonstrations. Police presence increased in several neighborhoods as authorities monitored the situation closely. As expected, large crowds soon gathered in downtown Oakland. Many protesters carried signs bearing Oscar Grant's name and demanded stronger accountability for police violence. The demonstrations began peacefully, with speakers addressing the crowd and calling for continued pressure on government institutions. As the evening progressed, tensions escalated. Some individuals within the crowds began damaging property and confronting police lines, echoing the unrest that had occurred during the early weeks after the shooting. Officers responded with crowd control measures, and dozens of arrests were reported during the disturbances. While protests unfolded in the streets, the legal process continued inside the court system. Mehserle's sentencing would determine how long he would serve in prison for the involuntary manslaughter conviction. Under California law, the potential sentence was far shorter than what a murder conviction would have carried. Later that year, the judge sentenced Johannes Mehserle to 2 years in state prison. The sentence included credit for time already served while awaiting trial. In practice, the total time he would spend behind bars would be less than a year. The sentence further intensified debates about justice and accountability. Supporters of Grant's family argued that the punishment did not reflect the seriousness of taking a human life. Others maintained that the legal system had followed the evidence presented during the trial. Regardless of perspective, the case had already left a lasting impact. The death of Oscar Grant had forced a national conversation about police use of force, the power of citizen video recordings, and the role of the justice system in evaluating actions taken by law enforcement officers. Years later, the events at the Fruitvale Station would continue to shape public discussions about policing in America. In 2013, director Ryan Coogler released the movie Fruitvale Station, which dramatized the final day of Grant's life and the events that unfolded at the station. The film introduced the case to a new audience and reinforced the emotional impact of the tragedy for viewers who had not followed the news coverage years earlier. More than anything, the case demonstrated the power of a single recorded moment to reshape public discourse. The images captured on those phones at the station forced the country to confront questions about police authority, accountability, and the relationship between communities and the institutions meant to protect them. Those debates continue today, influenced in part by the memory of what happened in Oakland during the first hours of 2009. The life of Oscar Grant lasted only 22 years, but the consequences of his death continue to echo through discussions about justice in America. His name remains part of a larger history of cases that have shaped how the nation understands police violence and public oversight. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real. In our next episode, we will examine a very different but equally shocking case: the 1998 murder of Phil Hartman, the beloved comedian and actor known for his work on Saturday Night Live and the animated series The Simpsons.